Okay, before we start on chapter 6 today, I wanted to show you a couple of things. A lot of times in the book, they talk about things that we may or may not know about, and it just helps me if I can look things up. And you're free to do that as well if you want, but I'm not going to obviously have time to look every single thing up. But I told you we've heard them talking about where Cracker is being trained now to go to. Um, Vietnam, and she's being trained at Fort Benning, Georgia. And if you look, this marker on the map here on Google Maps shows you where Fort Benning, Georgia is. And I kind of wanted to show you because here's where we are in Kentucky, how far away um, Fort Benning would be from us, and kind of give you an idea that it's right on the line um, between Alabama and Georgia, not too far from Columbus, Georgia. And there you can kind of see the area. The red line kind of shows you the area of the fort, not too far from the city of Columbus, Georgia, right on the Alabama Georgia line. So I thought that was pretty cool to find out where Cracker is. She's in a warm area, not too far from us. All right, and another thing I wanted to share with you, we've heard a lot about Cracker being a sentry dog. If she didn't behave before um, she got into training, when she was being aggressive, she was angry about Willie. And so I wanted to make sure you understood what a sentry dog was. If the dogs couldn't learn the training in order to go to Vietnam and be useful, if they couldn't become obedient, they could have trained them to be a sentry dog, and that's just a fancy word for a guard dog. And all they had to do to be a guard dog is just what this definition says. They were large, aggressive dogs trained to guard persons or property. They were a watchdog. So if they couldn't accomplish the different types of trainings and obedience that was required to go to Vietnam and help the soldiers with that, then they would be just used as guard dogs. And so, luckily, that's not what Cracker ended up doing. Um, and we're not going to watch this clip right now, but another thing that we heard about was Rick volunteered to go to Vietnam. But one of the things that the United States did um, when the Vietnam War swung into action was something called the draft. And in America, when young men turn 18, they're required to register for something called selective service, and you just go online and do it. And that the draft has not been used or enacted since the Vietnam War, and I don't look for it to ever be used again. But it's just something that if there were an emergency or something that happened, it would just be just a quick way to get in touch um, with um, people so that we can protect our country or take care of our country. It's called conscription. I know in Asia and Asian countries, like especially in South Korea, because of the tensions between South and North Korea, that South Korean men, and I don't know what the age ranges are, but they are required, every single South Korean male is required to serve um, in the military for, I don't know if it's a year or 2 years. I believe it's 2 years in some aspect. It doesn't mean they're at war. It might be that they're training. It might be that they're doing like now, like we've had tornadoes, natural disasters, and you have different parts of the military going in and helping that, but they all serve because they have a fear that they may have to rise up against North Korea or whatever. And I believe this is true for a lot of Asian countries. I believe China, it's true for them as well. I don't know. I just seem like I've heard this, but so they don't have. I don't. I think they have a draft, but they're all in the military. I mean, they can be called up. They all are in the military because they're all required to serve. This is not true for America, but men are required to register. So if they need you, they can call you up and train you. What I want you to watch, we yesterday in chapter 5, we read about what Cracker was being trained for was to find something that they called in chapter 5 booby traps. And one of the things about Vietnam that was very, very different, and I don't know if the men dealt with this as much in the Korean War, but they weren't fighting an obvious enemy. And if you think of it, it sort of um, goes along with, well, it was called guerrilla warfare. And some of you guys that play video games may have heard of this. But if you think about a basketball game or any type of a game, you know who the opposing team is. They're wearing a different uniform. And everybody that you're competing against is wearing a uniform. And this used to always be true for battles, military action. Um, a little bit different would maybe have been the American Revolutionary War because we had militia of civilians, which was sort of what enacted the draft, but where we, as people who were becoming a nation, fought against the British. We didn't have really an established army at that time. We had, of course, General George Washington, who later became our first president, who was leading an army, but it wasn't a large army yet. So a lot of citizens would get their whatever guns that they had that they used normally to, hunt to feed their family or whatever. They would form militia and be organized and join the army just for certain times when they as needed. Um, and they didn't obviously have uniforms, but during the Vietnam War, one of the things that the Viet Cong did, which was the North Vietnam would come in and they would a lot of times force, but sometimes not force, regular civilians to fight for them. So very rarely did the American soldiers actually fight against uniformed enemies. And one of the difficulties for them was a lot of times they would the Viet Cong or VC as they call them would use women and little children, and this is common in the Middle East now, in Iraq and Afghanistan and those wars. They don't know who to trust. You have to be leery of everybody. And they would have, roadside bombs, but they would have in these jungles, they were very impassable. They used helicopters to get in and out of areas because you couldn't um, drive into a lot of the areas because um, it was a third world country. And um, one of the ways that they fought the soldiers was sneak attack. And they would do that by hiding behind things and shooting at them. But they would also have these booby traps set up. So this is a little clip of a training video of the um, from the army where they're talking to the men about it. So I wanted to show you just a little bit of this.
This is a foot trap usually used by the Viet Cong, local guerrilla, and sometimes the hardcore. The spikes could be spread with filth or some type of poison. This would not kill you, but this would knock you out of action for a week or 2 weeks. The BC hand grenade. This end is tied to a stake, this end to a tree or another stake across a trail. When a soldier walks, he trips the wire, the fuse is pulled, and this bursts immediately. You'll find signs similar to this one in many villages that are controlled by the Viet Cong. The things you should do first is check it out for booby traps. You'll find that GIs come along and don't check signs out. The first thing they do is grab it. It's a crude weapon indeed, but very effective. All it is a weight, bamboo, and some nails. It may not kill you, but it'll knock you out of action.
So as you can see, and these guys were constantly being bombarded with um, different types of booby traps. And one of the things that really affected them was this constant fear of walking into something like this. So they would walk through these jungles and not know. And there were so many varieties and different kinds that were hidden in these green leafy areas. And the guys would be so scared and so distracted by they. It's one of the main causes of PTSD was the fear of these traps. And last chapter we saw Cracker being trained to listen for the sound of wind blowing over a tight um, a tight piece of wire, which was the tripwire that the gentleman was talking about there in the video, or to smell gunpowder, because that's what they use as their explosive. And they would have, nails and spikes and things like that. Um, and here's a picture of one of the things that the officer was showing. I didn't know there was a pig in this picture, but it's something called a punji pit, and you'll hear it talked about in Cracker. I don't know when, obviously, when he gets in country, but where they would, and there's different, more elaborate versions. This is a simplistic version where they would dig a hole in a path where the men would walk, and cover it up with something just like they showed. But these spikes would be covered with human waste, feces, or whatever. And so when the guys would step on these, they would go through their shoe, and it would go, maybe scratch a leg, and it obviously wouldn't kill them, but it would make them, like the gentleman said, it would make them not be able to be in war for a while. But the bacteria on this spike from the filth would cause them to become very sick. And when you're in the middle of the jungle, even though the Americans did have MASH units, medical units set up, obviously you're not in a hospital. And so it's just a little bit of a different situation. So it did present a difficulty for the men. Another thing they used a lot, and I know you people that play these video games, was something called a Claymore mine. And this gentleman in this picture is, I don't know if he's deactivating or activating one, but they didn't look anything like I thought they would look. But now I think they have like laser sensors, but these were weight censored back in the Vietnam War. And they would hook them up and they would bury them under the ground. And if you stepped on them, when you step on them, you may or may not know that you'd step on them, but they would explode when you moved off of them. And again, they might not necessarily kill you, but they could blow, cause you to lose a limb, or they could very well kill you, just depending on the situation you were in. And not only did the Viet Cong use these, but the Americans also use these. And you'll hear this talked about a lot in the book. This is a picture of a rice paddy, which we haven't talked about yet. We talk about Rick being in country. In Asia, where Americans eat a lot of potatoes, because that was easy to grow and cheap and very filling, and it has starch in it, which is a sugar, which gives a lot of energy. But in these Asian countries that are very hot, very tropical, and wet, they have a wet season, rainy season, and a dry season. They eat a lot of rice, and the reason they do this is because just like potatoes grow well for us in our climate, rice grows well for them in their climate. And I just wanted to show you one of the ways that they grow rice is in something called a rice paddy, and they're flooded fields. Rice actually grows in water in these flooded fields, and you'll see that they're pulling it up in bunches, and the rice is just like when you're out in the field and you see, like, any of you boys or even girls that live on farms that mow hay, and you know how that, or a weed, a seeds that get on the end of a fescue or of any kind of wheat that's growing in the field. That's the rice is the same concept. It's the seed for the plant. So they're harvesting, they're actually planting. I'm sorry, they're not harvesting, they're actually planting the rice, because you can see how loose it is. And it gets somewhat taller, not a lot taller. But they have harvesting machines now that they use. And but then they would do it all by hand. But they now have irrigation systems where they'll actually flood the fields, and then they can also drain the fields when they're ready to harvest it with the machines. Because obviously you can't drive a machine through this, but you'll hear them talk about that a lot. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and show you this. This is an underground tunnel system. You see this gentleman in one, and we'll watch a little video clip from that later on when we actually get into the chapter where it discusses it. But a lot of the war was actually fought. North Vietnamese used, like I said, citizens to fight this war, and a lot of them lived underground, and like all day long they would stay underground, and they would only come out at night. So, and one of the things the Americans had to deal with was finding these elaborate tunnel systems. And I'm telling you, they even had, and you'll see, it was unbelievable. They kept their kids, they went to school underground, they had hospitals underground, they literally lived underground. And they would, like, the soldiers would come out during the day and look to see what was going on, and they could find it was like everybody disappeared. It's wild. So I think you guys will find it interesting when we start watching the clips and we get into this, and we'll read about the tunnel rats that actually the Americans had to train these guys to get through these tunnels, and this was a new thing. This is not something that they'd ever had to deal with before. So when we come to that chapter, we'll look at it. But for now, let's get on with chapter 6. Okay, so we left Rick and Crocker and Cody in 2020 and their dogs. They were all home when all the other guys were out on arrest at R&R weekend, they called it. And now they're just in the middle of training. They're training. So they're all waiting. And the guys got there late. They're training on the helicopters. The dogs won't be afraid of helicopters and all these things. So, chapter 6. As Rick headed for formation, adrenaline pumped through him. He, 2020, and Cody were now in an unspoken race to be the best in class. Like last week when Cracker had not only sniffed out the booby trap she was supposed to, but the sergeant had let her go for an entire hour finding trap after trap and a couple of hidden men. She even sniffed out a man hiding underwater. This is one of the things the Viet Cong did too. It was very interesting. She was a thing of wonder, and so far she was the only dog to sniff out a man underwater. Rick figured all he'd get for his troubles would be a stripe for promotion, a minuscule pay raise, and a cheap trophy. But fair was fair. They were becoming the best dog team, and he knew it. Cody in 2020 probably thought they were the best teams, and while Rick had to admit Bruno and Tristy were pretty good, well, he just thought Cracker was better. It was nothing personal against the other dogs. But there was another reason Rick wanted to be the best. He planned to come home without getting hurt. Rick had read the training manual twice, and he never read a book twice in his life. He planned to read the manual one more time before training ended. He wanted everything to be second nature by the time he got to Vietnam. That way, he had a better chance of derossing in one piece. Deross meant date of expected return from overseas. Another guy passed with his dog, and Rick kind of looked away. The guy knew he'd pulled a bad dog, a scrawny mutt with the ridiculous moniker, which is a fancy word for name, of Adonis. Adonis just didn't seem to have the knack. He hit booby traps with such regularity that the guys called him no-nos. Rick had to admit that he now felt secretly thankful to U-Haul for assigning him Cracker. Rick slowed down when he heard Cody call out behind him. "Rick, you think they're feeding the dogs enough?" Cody said. "Bruno's always hungry." "I don't know," Rick said. He lowered his voice. "I give Cracker treats every so often." Cody lowered his voice. "Sometimes I give Bruno an extra meal." Cracker suddenly lunged at something. Rick pulled hard on her leash. "No." 2020 leaned over. "It's a snake." He leaned closer. "It's an eastern hognose." Rick struggled to control Cracker. "Sit," he shouted. And finally she did. He shook her snout. "Bad girl." He sure didn't want her going after snakes or other animals in Vietnam. The handlers and their dogs fell into formation as U-Haul approached carrying a chicken, of all things. 24 men stood together in the platoon. The guys all glanced at one another as if U-Haul was crazy, which of course he was. The sergeant started to shout, but halted as several helicopters roared overhead. Nearly all the dogs strained on their leashes to reach the chicken. Cracker was going wild. A private Rick had never seen joined Sarge as the helicopters continued to roar. The way Rick heard it, the Vietnam War was sometimes called the helicopter war. With choppers, entire companies could maneuver with greater speed than ever before. Each chopper would carry 10 or so men at a time for about a big battle and later fly the soldiers back to base camp for a warm meal that night in the mess hall. At least, that's the way Rick pictured it. Even before the helicopters had completely passed, the sergeant was already screaming, though not at anyone. He just paced back and forth screaming. Rumor was Sarge screamed in his sleep. "You cannot stop a dog from alerting at an animal, but you must control your dog. Your dog must understand that it is not his job to hunt down animals." The chicken squawked nervously. The dog barked wildly, pulling hard on their leashes. except Bruno. Bruno was mighty interested in the chicken, but he sat under control at Cody's side. Meanwhile, it took all Rick's strength to control Cracker. Finally, he shouted, "No!" and gave a hard jerk on the chain, and she sulkily sat down. Drool began puddling beneath her on the ground. Dang, he thought. He'd seen dogs like her before, where the prey drive ran like wolf blood through them. One farmer, he remembered, had ended up shooting his own dog when she killed half his chickens. Then Cracker tried a new tactic, sitting her best sit in front of him. "No," he cried. After a moment, Sarge handed the terrified chicken to the private next to him. "Okay, you can take her back to the chef," he said. He turned to the squad. "Got a senator visiting Benning for dinner tonight. Need to have some kind of special gourmet chicken." The private walked off with the senator's dinner. Sarge looked at the men suddenly and shouted, "The scout dog must be trained to work on airborne scent alone." Rick mouthed the words with him. He knew that part by heart. They all did. Sarge bellowed, "These dogs are scout dogs, not trackers. A dog with his nose on the ground tracking a ground scent might lead you directly into ambush. Determine wind and terrain upon arrival to the mission site. Think, think, think about the scent cone. Private Lansky, what does a strong wind mean?" U-Haul always said Rick's name wrong. Always. But annoying as it was, Rick wasn't about to correct him because he figured that's exactly what U-Haul was trying to goad him into doing. Instead, he shouted back, "Sergeant, a strong wind means a narrow scent cone." The scent cone was a three-dimensional shape a scent made in the air. The center of the cone was the booby trap, weapons cache, foods cache, Viet Cong soldier, or whatever else the dog was smelling. Given even terrain and stable wind conditions, scent moved outward from the center in the shape of a cone. If you didn't watch your dog carefully, you could lead him right out of the scent cone. The men waited while U-Haul stood speechless. Rick moved his eyes, but couldn't see what U-Haul was staring at. Then, a general's daughter walked by. She was cute as heck, but a snotty little princess. She liked to walk by the enlisted men and ignore them. "Never take your eyes off your dog," Sarge resumed, shouting directly at Rick. "If there's one rule you must always follow in the field, it's never take your eyes off your dog. Your slack man will protect your back." A slack man was the bodyguard who was assigned to each dog handling team. A team was one man, one dog, inseparable. The handler watched the dog, and the slack man guarded the handler. Rick tried not to look bored. Cracker panted eagerly. Finally, Sarge stopped shouting. Cracker was looking adoringly at Rick. He smiled at her. "Private, are you listening?" Rick looked up. "Absolutely, Sergeant. You said—" "I said, in this part of the training, your dog is no longer simply following your orders. You are following your dog. If your dog alerts, you must be watching, always. You become a single entity. Never take your eyes off your dog. They got as many beautiful girls in Vietnam as any country in the universe. They got nothing but girls. They got more beautiful girls than leaves in the jungle." One of the guys said, "Woo-hoo." Now, if Rick had said that, woo-hoo, he'd be doing push-ups until lunchtime. But U-Haul ignored the other guy. Still, Rick called out, "Yes, Sergeant. Leaves in the jungle, Sergeant. Tact and diplomacy." His parents had taught him fairness. Now he was learning politics. The men loaded their gear, including tents, onto the trucks that would take them into the field training. They were crossing the border into Alabama today. A couple of guys had to tie up their more aggressive dogs before helping load. One of the guys had a dog who was just plain crazy. The dog wouldn't let anyone within 10 feet of his handler, and he howled for hours when he and his handler were separated. But he seemed to have good sniffing abilities, so the army was holding on to him. Cracker didn't think the dog was crazy. He was just protecting his handler. She kind of respected him. She yawned and lay patiently next to Bruno and Tristy as Rick, Cody, and 2020 worked. Whenever the guys loaded the truck, it meant they were going away for a while to sleep in the field. She liked that. The loud man started shouting it so loudly that Cracker moved her eyes away from Rick. Remember, in the field, you never take your eyes off the dog. Cracker moved her eyes back to Rick and felt a slight thrill as he moved his eyes to her. A soft drizzle fell on her nose. She could smell the loud man from where she lay. He smelled loud, just like Cody smelled happy. Rick smelled calm and confident, and 20 smelled worried. Rick looked away. Cracker rested her nose on Tristy's back. When the truck was loaded, Rick looked at Cracker and called out, "Hup!" Cracker timed her leap into the truck to coincide with when Rick hopped up. She landed a second before he did and turned to wait for him. "Good girl," he said. She wagged her tail. The Sarge came near her and she growled. Rick grabbed the leash. "No," he said. She sat down. She liked the same people and dogs Rick liked. He obviously didn't like the Sarge. Rick rumbled through the rain. The truck rumbled through the rain. The rain destroyed some of the smells that Crocker was used to, but it only created new smells, wet smells. Once the truck passed a deer along the highway, and all the dogs hung off the side barking furiously. Cracker thought about jumping off, but she had a feeling Rick wouldn't like that. If it were Willie, she would have done it anyway and let him come and get her. She hadn't thought of Willie for a while. He'd been her best friend, but she and Rick had something else, something bigger. She wasn't sure what it was. All she knew was that when he came to her in the morning, she had no choice but to twirl around and chase her tail before sitting down in front of him. She'd always celebrated when Willie came home, too, but this was different. With Willie, she'd felt that when they were separated, he was where he was and she was where she was. But with Rick, she felt she was kind of with him all the time. And when he came in person, she was even more with him. As soon as the truck stopped and everybody jumped off, Cracker gave herself a good shake. All the other dogs gave themselves a good shake. All the men held up their hands and called out, "No!" Cracker thought that was funny. The rain stopped and the air grew heavy with scents. Cracker lifted her nose and sniffed. A feeling of joy washed through her. So many good smells. "What direction is the wind blowing, Private?" cried out the loud man. Rick saw that Cracker's nose had lifted toward the northwest. "From the northwest, Sergeant." "Think you're smart, Private?" "I'm sorry, Sergeant?" "I said, think you're smart, Private?" "No, Sergeant." "Think you're dumb, Private?" "No, Sergeant." "Well, which is it, smart or dumb?" Rick hesitated before realizing that there was no right answer, so he said, "Cracker and I are going to whip the world, Sergeant." Rick could tell the sergeant liked that answer. Sarge turned suddenly toward Cody. "What the heck are you grinning about?" "Nothing, Sergeant," cried Cody. Sarge snapped back to Rick. "Go to it, soldier." Rick performed the crossover, removing Cracker's choke chain and slipping on her work harness. That's how she knew life was about to get serious. Rick secured anything on Cracker or himself that might jingle and alert the enemy. He taped his dog tags together as they'd been taught to do. He wanted to ask whether they weren't going to set up camp first, but Sarge was looking at him impatiently. So he said quietly but urgently, "Search, Cracker, search." She surged forward. Rick jerked the leash to correct her. Not too fast, or she might miss something. In Vietnam, she could cost Rick his life. Cracker loved running. She loved pulling too. Rick didn't like when she pulled, but she didn't hold that against him. She restrained herself as she moved forward into the shallow swamp. Rick following. The other men lagged far behind. The mud-colored swamp sucked at her feet with each step, making a soft slurp noise as she moved her paws. But she smelled something important. She stood very still, her ears rotating in the direction of the sound, her nose raised up to sniff. There it was. She pointed her nose and then turned with pride to Rick. A bird in a tree. He jerked her leash. The sergeant told them that you could never ever teach a dog not to alert to animals, but you had to discourage it anyway. He thought again of the farmer who'd shot his dog, but he pushed the thought out of his mind. "No, search," Rick said. Rick felt annoyed. Cracker had improved since he'd met her, but every so often she surprised him by taking off after a squirrel or a bird. Rick rearranged the rucksack on his back. It weighed 55 pounds, less than he would carry most days in Nam, but it already felt heavy. Swamp water and sweat drenched his clothes. Sweat dripped into his eyes. He already wanted to take off his steel pot or helmet, but if he did, a piece of shrapnel might hit him. Of course, since he was just training, there was no shrapnel, but Rick resisted the urge to take off his helmet. He needed to get used to it, and he knew U-Haul would yell at him if he took it off. Okay, guys, that word shrapnel, what that means is if there was a grenade or some sort of explosion, or perhaps a bullet hit something, for example, a piece of metal, it might blow up. And a shard or a sharp piece of the metal is called shrapnel. And sometimes that would cause the guys more harm than the bullets themselves would. If you can picture, like, when a mirror breaks or a piece of glass breaks, how it breaks off and makes those sharp pieces, sometimes big, sometimes small. Metal will do the same thing when it's hit by an explosive or by a big enough bullet. So, one of the reasons that the guys wore those helmets, one of the reasons they had to try and protect themselves wasn't just bullets, but it was from the shrapnel. And as I say, most of the damage that was done was from different kinds of shrapnel. It could be wood, it could be any type of harder material, but typically metal was the issue. Cracker gazed longingly at the bird again, but felt the chain jerk on her neck. She'd killed a bird once while she and Willie were out in the forest. She knew it was a bird because Willie had taught her that word. She would never forget killing the bird because it was so much fun, but she could feel Rick's annoyance. She sniffed at the air. There was something, a smell Rick had taught her about. The scent seemed stronger to the left. Cracker waded through the swamp, thinking of only one thing now, the smell to the left. She pulled Rick out of the swamp and walked directly into the smell. It was everywhere, flooding into her nose, and she heard the faint whistling rhythm of someone breathing. She pricked her ears up. She could also smell the breath coming from whoever was breathing. What you got, girl? Rick said urgently. She felt the hair on her back stand up. Grr, she answered him. Ouch! Rick had yanked her harness. Quiet, he whispered. She changed suddenly. She charged suddenly, and a man jumped up from a thick bush and ran off. She lunged after him, ripping at his pants. Rick called, Stay, stay. Cracker reluctantly stopped. Good girl, Rick said. Cracker felt his face rubbing all over hers. Good girl, he said again. She rubbed her face back against his. She felt satisfied all over. Then she lifted her head sharply. She still heard something. She turned back to where the man had run from and stood straight up. From far away, she heard the sound Rick had taught her to listen for, the sound of wind passing around a wire pulled tight. She faintly smelled gunpowder. She looked up at Rick, questioning him, and he looked at the loud man, who nodded. Rick said, Search, girl. She knew exactly where the sound was coming from, so she pulled Rick more than she knew he liked, but she didn't pull so much that he reprimanded her. She was getting to know him really well. The forest grew dense, the smell dispersed, but the sound was unmistakable. As soon as she was sure what it was and where, she sat down and stared toward the source of the sound. Rick said, What you got, girl? She looked at him and then turned back to the sound. Couldn't he hear it? Rick repeated, What you got, girl? He stepped around her and cautiously moved forward, scanning up and down to make sure he didn't miss anything. Cracker followed him and pawed at him once. Rick knew he'd tripped the wire almost before he'd actually tripped it. Later, he wondered how he'd known beforehand. Unfortunately, he didn't know in time to stop. The booby trap exploded, though of course it wasn't real gunpowder. Rick wanted to kick himself, and it was all his fault. Cracker had given a strong alert, and he'd moved past her because he hadn't seen anything. The instructor moved up beside him. You know what the soldiers fighting in Vietnam would call that, Private? I don't know, Sergeant. A BK, the instructor said. During 3 months of basic, 3 months of AIT, and now dog handling school, Rick had learned a lot of the slang that the guys used in Vietnam. It was supposedly like a whole new language, but he hadn't heard BK yet. What's a BK? He asked dejectedly. That stands for below the knee amputation. The instructor turned to the rest of the squad. All right, who's up next? The next team moved forward. Rick, Cracker, and the others lagged about 60 yards behind so as to not interfere with whatever the point dog was smelling. Point meant in front. One of the dog team's primary jobs in country would be to walk point in front of other soldiers. This was one of the most dangerous jobs in Vietnam because it meant that if there was a booby trap, you would be the first upon it. Rick's dejection turned his legs to lead. He let Cracker down. He let himself down. Cracker sniffed at him as if trying to smell his feelings. Good girl, he whispered. And she felt happy because he said that, but also kind of sad because she could tell he felt sad. Okay, so he did the wrong thing because if that had been real, then that that booby trap that he tripped the wire might have blown his leg off. That's what below the knee amputation means. He would have been injured seriously.